Welcome to Think Like the MCAT, a brand new CARS passage series that is the most AAMC representative yet. We're not exaggerating about that either. In our focus group testing, 100% of people agreed. We're incredibly excited about this resource. These passages are first and foremost meant to give you insight into the logic, reasoning, and wordings specific to AAMC style CARS. Think of this as training for the real thing. We want you to be able to reason through a tough passage or question and answer set in the exact way one of the top CARS testers in the country would. The text explanations here are designed to be sufficient on their own, but for those who want a little more or want to hear about some cool tips and tricks, make sure you watch the videos as well. I tend to speak pretty slowly, so don't be afraid to watch the videos on a faster speed. I'd recommend 1.25 or 1.5x. In med school, you'll definitely be speeding up all your videos. You should thoroughly review each question and answer to maximize your understanding of CARS reasoning. That being said, if you can quickly verify that you in fact fully understood everything, there's no need to waste your time. Each video is time-stamped so you can watch as much or as little as you need. Finally, because the passages here may overlap with the AAMC's adaptation of the source text, make sure you do those first. We'll be releasing more passages in the future, and we welcome any feedback or requests. But that's enough from me. It's time to think like the MCAT. Hi everyone, welcome to Think Like the MCAT. This is the video explanation for our free trial passage on the Western intellectual tradition. We'll start off with the main idea, which for this passage was that the Enlightenment philosophers used satire as a method for challenging societal conventions. Next, we typically talk about some high-yield points that help you think like the MCAT. Our first Think Like the MCAT point here is on keywords. So what is a keyword? A keyword in an MCAT question is any which defines the criteria that distinguishes what a good answer will be from what a bad one will be. And since that's obviously super important, we need to make sure we read every single question extremely carefully in order to present missing a single keyword. Some clear examples of these keywords might be the word not or except. But other ones could include things like from a certain person's point of view. You wouldn't want to get the opposite point of view. Anytime something like that is mentioned, it's key. Our second Think Like the MCAT point for this passage is on rephrasings. This is something the AAMC loves to do. In AAMC CARS, they'll often use words or phrases that are very similar to, but not exactly the same as what the passage said. A lot of times this will make people uncomfortable, but it's okay. Quotes don't have to be exactly word for word what the passage said. What we're ultimately concerned with is, do we think they're talking about the same idea? In fact, sometimes people will get tricked by things which are pulled word for word from the passage. So this is one of the key reasons why we'll want to make sure we spend a lot of time with the official CARS practice. And think like the MCAT, of course. Okay, so now we're going to go through and break down the passage paragraph by paragraph. This can be really helpful for those of you who struggle with reading comprehension. If you typically feel pretty good with that, though, you may just want to skip ahead right to the questions. And you can do that using the timestamps below. In paragraph 1, we get introduced to the task of the philosopher. They had to both demolish an old system as well as construct a new one. And they did this by changing Descartes' method of doubt into Voltaire's method of satire. Now, in paragraph 2, the author defines satire for us as a mode of challenging accepted notions by making them seem ridiculous. The author then goes on to explain a little bit about satire, such as that it occurs in an age of crisis when there's no absolute uniformity in two sets of beliefs, where one of these sets of beliefs has enough power to attack the established order, and this occurs only in an age of reason. And the author says that we need things to be civilized and people to be reasonable in order for there to be satire. Now, the third paragraph tells us that the Enlightenment was more powerful than the Renaissance because it could build on the Renaissance's accomplishments. So through this, they finished the task of demolishing the old foundations of society, and they did it by using satire. Remember back to the first paragraph that this was what the philosophers had to do. We get a bunch of philosopher names dropped here, but nothing that necessarily stands out as particularly important. However, the author concludes this paragraph with a very important statement. Here the author is differentiating between Descartes' view and Montesquieu and Voltaire's view. The author says that Descartes said that travel among varied people will unburden our minds of the notion that everything against our modes is ridiculous and against reason. whereas Montesquieu and Voltaire said that travel shows that not other people's customs, but rather our own customs, are the ones that are ridiculous. In the second to last paragraph, we're introduced to an example of satire being applied, called the imaginary travel story, which was first successfully published by Montesquieu. It tells us about the book's plot, two Persians visiting France, and in it we see their outsider's view of all the French customs. This includes things like why men are the ones who wear trousers in Europe, where in Persia it's the opposite, that they're worn by women. And these things that people in Montesquieu's world would take for granted are being made fun of by these Persian visitors. Montesquieu then goes on to progressively challenge other accepted things of the time. So he's moving further and further into societal views and challenging all of them. But we note that it seems like Montesquieu has started with a bit more lighthearted or superficial topics prior to asking the reader more significant questions. In the final paragraph, we get this explained a little bit further. The author explains that if Montesquieu had put these more significant challengings in the beginning of the book, people would be unsympathetic and they would close it. But this system of progressively challenging everything that society accepts allowed the Persian letters to be very popular. And in fact, other people even started to copy it. So again, to recap, this passage is all about how satire was a method for the Enlightenment philosophers to challenge what society accepted. And we're given an example of how specifically they would do this with Montesquieu's imaginary travel story. We should also take a second to read our title, which is The Western Intellectual Tradition, but unfortunately that doesn't really help us at all. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with question 1. Which of the following best represents the passage's central idea? So here, clearly, we just want the main idea. For these, it can be helpful to predict, what do I think the main idea is, and look for that one. It may not be in the exact same phrasing as you used, but it should be similar. Okay, answer choice A. As a result of its satire, Montesquieu's imaginary travel story was popular amongst Enlightenment readers. So first off, let's consider, is this true? Was Montesquieu's imaginary travel story popular, and was it because of its satire? Based on what we learned later on in the passage, both of those do seem to be true. But now we need to think about, was this the main idea? Was the ultimate point that the author was trying to get across to us that Montesquieu's imaginary travel story was popular because it used satire? Probably not. It seems more so that the author used Montesquieu's imaginary travel story as an example of how satire was used by these philosophers. Option B says, for Enlightenment philosophers, satire was a method of creating systemic change. How does that one sound? The idea of satire being used to create systemic change seems to be a good fit for what the author was trying to tell us about these Enlightenment philosophers. This was what the passage started with in the beginning, and it was what Montesquieu's imaginary travel story was an example of. At this point, we should be thinking that B is better than A. This is a better representation of the passage's central idea. Next, we have choice C. Satire can be used to dismantle societal and philosophical uniformity. Now, based on what the author said about satire, what do we think about this? Is this one true? Well, as far as dismantling society, that sounds good. But dismantling societal uniformity or philosophical uniformity? Not so much. Choice C can be eliminated. Next we have, the Enlightenment was a more powerful movement than the Renaissance due to satire. This one was mentioned in paragraph 3. The Enlightenment was more powerful than the Renaissance. Was it due to satire, though? And was it the passage's main idea? Well, we see that the reason the Enlightenment was more powerful than the Renaissance was because it could base itself on the Renaissance's accomplishments, and they could do this through satire. However, the passage seems to imply that it may have been more than just satire alone. So, basing itself on the latter's accomplishments isn't necessarily the same as due to satire. Probably more importantly, though, is the fact that this just isn't the main idea. This one can't be right either. The author is trying to tell us about how Enlightenment philosophers use satire. And the best fit for that is going to be choice B. Alright, one down, only 6 more to go. Moving on to question 2. According to the passage, why did the imaginary travel story become the favorite form of satire for the 18th century? So note that it says according to the passage. Let's go back and see what the passage said about this. This came from the second to last paragraph. But note that by saying thus, it's actually referring back to the previous paragraph, which is discussing the idea that our own customs are what is ridiculous. So the idea that traveling shows that not other people's customs, but rather our own, are ridiculous is what allowed the imaginary travel story to become a favorite form of satire. Let's see what matches up here. It satirically questioned religious doctrines. Now, this is definitely true if we look back to the final paragraph. Only then can Montesquieu expose more consequential practices of society, such as doctrinal issues of contemporary religions. But the question that we need to ask ourselves is this satirical questioning of religion why the imaginary travel story became the favorite form of satire? And unfortunately, this seems a little bit too narrow. So let's move on and see if we can find something better. Next we have the methods of satire were simple and easy to understand. That sounds like something that might appeal to the general public. But what does our passage actually say? We'll note that the passage says in the final paragraph that the work was perfectly calculated to appeal to the polite, urbane, and sophisticated members of French society. Sophisticated doesn't really sound like people who would need simple and easy to understand forms of satire. So this answer isn't really a good fit. Option C says it used satire to expose usual practices as absurd. Now this one is a great fit for the idea that travel shows that our own customs are ridiculous. It also fits very well with our main idea conception of satire, which is that satire is used to challenge accepted aspects of society by making them seem ridiculous. So exposing usual practices as absurd is an excellent fit. This will almost certainly be our answer. But let's check out choice D. Through satire, readers could travel to new places. This is a lovely sounding answer choice, the idea that reading can take you anywhere. Unfortunately, it wasn't the point of satire. And it wasn't why the imaginary travel story in particular was popular. That had to do with exposing societal customs as ridiculous. So D is not a good fit, and our best answer still is going to be choice C.